Ah, there we go. We've managed to overcome technical difficulties and now we've done it.
Awesome,
Welcome
awesome.
to our live on how relationships have helped us grow, evolve, develop, and changed our lives. So, for the benefit of my audience, do you want to tell everyone a little bit about who you are?
Yeah, sure. So I am the abundance coach, and I primarily work with singles and originally mostly in relationship, but that's actually sort of shifting right now towards just general motivation, productivity, and helping people achieve the dreams that they want to achieve. So um, that is definitely what I'm focused on now. And yeah, it's pretty interesting, like switching sort of like your client niche and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Beautiful. I think there's a lot of wonderful things that you're doing at the moment too. I think that there are a lot of people who are very doubtful about, achieving a life that they want for themselves. And I think with someone such as yourself who's guiding a light for them and actually inspiring them in their singleness in whatever aspect of their life that they're looking for is really valuable. And as for your audience who may not know me, so my name is Ken. I'm a relationship coach for gay men. I help my clients delete their dating apps, raise their self-esteem, and boost their communication skills so they can attract an open, honest, and communicative partner who they want to spend their life with. So no more open relationships. But on the note of relationships, I guess the first thing that I would want to say is that for me, as I was just saying in the pre-intro to this entire thing, I feel like this topic is like my bread and butter. I can talk about relationships for days. I get so excited about the functionality of them, the dynamics of them. And I know that for some people, they'll say things like, oh, relationships are supposed to be organic, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, yes, I get that. But I think there's so much depth to the way in which we interact with people as social creatures, the way in which we evolve. And I think it'd be wonderful to hear, like, in summary, your thoughts and feelings around the topic of relationships too.
Oh my gosh. See, this is such a crazy topic because we wanted to combine relationships and growth. And for some reason, even though if you talk to anybody I know, they'll be like, "Oh, Joyce always talks about relationships, whether it's romantic or friendships or whatever." Um, I just haven't thought about those two things
Mm.
together. And when I thought about it, it brought up a memory that I had from college. It was like after I had slept with this guy, and it was pillow talk basically. And he was sort of saying like, "Hey, Joyce, do you feel like your greatest source of stress is people related?" And I was sort of like, yeah, like what other things are there to be stressed about? Like I literally didn't know what other options there were. And so now I'm like, okay, well, I guess there might be other things to be stressed about. But generally, it's sort of like, okay, so if they're my greatest source of stress, then I also feel like they're my greatest source of joy. So I think it's growing with people, growing through relationships as well. Like there's so much growth happening like in and around it that I'm like, can you even really talk about these things together? And I think there's certain relationships that certainly facilitate more growth.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't know. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I love everything you're saying, and it got me thinking to a really powerful expression that was made, that was basically designed by the Japanese. They had this idea of, I think it's called like satori and kensho, and basically what that means is growth due to impact in your life. And I don't remember exactly which line it was. It's the satori or the kensho that refers to like dramatic growth. But one of the key things that I would say to that is that anytime I've gone into a romantic relationship, I have been with someone who's been a significant friend in my life. I have had humongous shifts in who I am as an individual. It could be being with the right people in a new environment where they just uplift you and raise your self-esteem. It could even be that I'm, with a partner who I dearly love and adore, and then they break up with me and I'm left, you know, on the floor trying to pick up the pieces and then looking at the pieces going, oh God, was this me? Do I even want to go back to who that person was? And I'd say the biggest shift I have ever had in the space of relationships, platonic, romantic, or otherwise, has definitely been off the back of romantic ones, because they often came with a lot of pain, a lot of learning. And I think that's where the real growth came from. And I can honestly say that the most recent, well, not the most recent, but one of the more recent breakups that I had definitely sparked a huge identity shift from me, because I went from being like a mass people pleaser, someone who was scared shitless about what other people thought of them, you know, was trying to impress everyone, to now being more like, yeah, I just want to focus on me and I just want to have my best life. So if you like the idea of that, come join me, because I ain't gonna be going out of my way for anyone else anymore. So that's an example of that sort of evolution for me. Would you say that it's been fairly similar for you?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely identify with all of that. And, you know, wondering, hey, is growth a result of pain? You know, I mean, I think growth can happen other times as well. But I don't know, when you were talking, it just sort of felt like, you know, it's less about the other person, but maybe more so like your relationship with yourself, because it's not the other person who changed you, it's how you responded to what happened to you.
Mm.
So that to me is sort of like, okay, well, yeah, relationships are a source of growth, but ultimately it's a decision that we make to take things a certain way, right? Like you can let a breakup crush you for years,
Mm.
or you can allow it to change you and become better because of it.
I would agree with everything you've just said. I think that you know, the people that we meet are more of like the stimulus for that. I think that more often than not, we'll interact with someone. And I always say that whenever you go dating, it's like having a mirror shown in your face, because you learn so much about yourself and your own behavior. But I think we often do things so unconsciously. We just behave in a way where we repeat the same patterns of behavior. We're not really thinking about what we're doing. And it takes, like, you know, you're right. For instance, when you were talking about a breakup can crush you for years, I think that goes to a bad saying that we've heard, which is, you know, oh, you know, it takes time to heal after a heartbreak. Sure, if you let it dwell on you for an extended period of time, but if you actually take the steps necessary to work on what those reasons are that you may be holding this person in a pedestal in your head, or you're just consumed by rage, then maybe that's not the healthiest approach, and it's going to prolong the agony of that too, and so you're not really growing. So I think it has to come with a level of awareness.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that reminds me of like my last sort of breakup situation. And, you know, when I think about it, I think had, part of me wanted to lean into the emotion for sure, like the sorrow and the rage and all of that, because it helps me feel closer to that person. But at the same time, a large part of it felt like out of my control because, you know, and my therapist has said this too, but, you know, especially with romance, it's sort of like your picture of of family, basically, somebody who's supposed to support you and protect you. And so that's why our deepest pain can sometimes come from romantic relationships when we're rejected by a sense of or a desire for belonging. And so, yeah, I don't know. I think a lot of it, because it's so subconscious, that rage and that sadness, I felt like kept going in ways that I couldn't control. And I think it is going back to the fact that, in therapy, you believe that, like, well, some therapists, right, that what you think leads to how you feel, and then how you feel leads back to the way you think, right? So it's sort of this cycle that affects each other. So I wonder if there were thoughts that I had that perpetuated this rage and this sorrow, where like I could have taken a step back and sort of let it go. But I think it's just so hard sometimes when you're in the middle of it, because I remember thinking to myself, like, I want to stop feeling this way. I mean, it's so painful, but not feeling like I could. You know, every time I thought of just like the interactions with that person, it would just like hit me like very viscerally. So it's very interesting to think about, like, can we control it? Can we not? And how much can we grow, right?
You're absolutely right. I've got so much to say to that, Joyce. I mean, you know, I think that my opinion would be that we can, but it depends on a lot of circumstances. I think that, for instance, if we grew up in a family where we didn't really feel the love and the warmth of our, you know, our paternal or our maternal figures, then then a loved one leaving us can be like adding not just salt, acid to the wound. Because, for instance, if you grow up in a family where you've got a very unemotional mother or father and you are attracted to, you know, a boy or a girl, and let's just say in my case, like I grew up with a family where my father was very emotionally unavailable and withdrawn. And so for me, that was a sense of abandonment right there. And then whenever a guy, you know, would reject me, it was like a double wound because I never felt that sense of security with another man before. So I think now that I've acknowledged that and I recognize that, it's forced me to undergo a massive amount of forgiveness work for not just my partners who, you know, abruptly left, but also for my family figures too. And just recognizing that, one, my rage is acceptable given the circumstances, that they were not able to fulfill the role of a caregiver in a way that was healthy and sustainable for me. But I also need to expel that energy out and also reconcile the fact that these people just, you know, in the case of my, you know, my family, my father in particular, you know, they probably weren't given the right love as a child, and they couldn't have possibly been prepared or equipped to work with children. And before this turns into a philosophical debate about, you know, nature, nurture, and all of the challenges of family dynamics, I think what I will really say is, individually, we can keep running that narrative in our head, being like, oh, I suffered from abandonment as a child, therefore I, you know, this is the way I love people. It's, you know, it's a tough love, blah, blah, blah. Or we can choose to accept the fact that this is the way it is, and I choose to forgive what happened in the past and embrace the fact that I need to now be the father to myself, essentially, in order to no longer feel as connected to that wound.
Yeah, no, I love that. I definitely, yeah, it's really interesting that I don't know, I guess while you're talking, I also just thought of like, you know, you were talking about self-awareness and being able to understand like where you're at and sort of acceptance of your emotions. And I think that, you know, during that time, it was sort of like realizing that I feel a certain way and I may not be able to change that, but I can change how I behave. So realizing that I eventually, I eventually want to be friends with this person again. And the way that my thoughts were going, it was just so angry and so bitter. And it was like tearing him down. Like every time I saw him at work, we worked together. Every time I saw him at work, it would be like, oh, like I would roll my eyes. I noticed like this sort of strange reaction in myself, and I didn't like that. So I told myself, you know what? Like I need to take my own space, right? Because I think in that mode, a lot of people act on their anger and their rage. They might send that, you know, text in the middle of the night, or, you know, drunk call them and leave an angry voice message. But, you know, for me, it was like, okay, I'm not done healing yet because I'm still thinking such mean things about him. And regardless of whether or not he was right or wrong, like, I think it's less about that, right? And for you, it's like less about blaming your parents for things. But you get to a point where you're just like, they're human, they mess up, and all I can do is sort of figure out how I've processed that and how I'm going to handle that moving forward. So, yeah, there were several things there, but
I can share with you on the rage part too. Like I've done that as well. Like I've slept with colleagues and sometimes, you know, other people too. And when I see them, I have this sort of like bitterness and resentment, and I'm like you, rolling my eyes, being like, ugh, this person. And Oh, hopefully you're back there. Yeah, no, that's all right. Got a little bit worried that you were missing out. But no, like I agree with you. Like, you know, it's just one of those things where you come into interaction with these individuals who you've been with, and if that rage is there, you feel it. And it can be very challenging to control when you're so triggered by it, because this is the other thing I was going to say too, which is it's kind of like being exposed to post-traumatic stress disorder, not in the way that probably a lot of our viewers might be thinking of it, which is like you had to have gone to Vietnam, Iraq to understand what what post-traumatic stress disorder is like. And it's like, no, every single human being undergoes complex post-traumatic stress disorder within some framework or another, because we're very sensitive creatures based on the way our central nervous system works. So being exposed to pain does inflict a level of trauma on us. And I think that when we are exposed to people like old loved ones who've hurt us, they are a trigger. I remember I was in a stage where I loved a guy very much, that when he broke up with me, I was not in a good way at all. And it was really, really magical and strange how this series of events unfolded. But basically, I remember I was in a situation where I really wanted to get back with him, because I thought, the relationship seemed perfect. I couldn't understand why he wanted to leave. And I kept chasing in my mind and feeling like a crazy ex-boyfriend as I was trying to, reconcile and reconnect with this guy. And I wasn't by any means blowing up his phone or, necessarily stalking him. It was more just the mental trying to like reconnect us. And it was only until about 4 months after the breakup when I reconciled the fact that, I actually don't want this guy back, because he wasn't able to be there for me or to even appreciate me. And then that mental shift happened. The day after that, I bumped into him at the gym by complete accident for the first time since he broke up with me. And I just remember thinking, now you show up after all this time that I'd spent looking for you, and now I'm mentally done with you. And the other thing that I felt was just like, I was shaking. I was like really, really worried to be in the same presence as this guy. He was acting like nothing had changed. He was very friendly. But I just remember thinking to myself, I want to get out of here so fast. And I could feel like I wanted to just leave my body. And so anytime I've even like remotely thought about that, I have this like visceral reaction where I feel like I'm starting to shake and I don't feel good. And so it does feel like what they describe as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. He is a trigger for me. And the only way that I, under the theory of this, that I would get better at dealing with this is by having small doses of exposure to him where I don't feel quite the same way, but I don't plan to, because my attitude is he's gone, goodbye. I don't want to have anything to do with him. But, it is amazing just how those interactions with people and the fallout of that can have such a humongous impact on our own well-being when we're in connection with them.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's so wild though, because I was going to say that I think we have very similar experiences, probably because we're both like anxious attachment, right? And so it's a very similar experience to find yourself chasing an avoidant, right? and that sense of like desperation, that sense of wanting to prove yourself and keep them, and do anything for them in a sense. And I think I realized for myself that this is one of my biggest shifts probably too, which is that a sense of inadequacy is not the same as having feelings for somebody. I used to get those feelings confused. So it was just sort of like realizing, I don't actually feel very strongly for this person. I just feel like shit when I'm around them. Like, I feel like I'm constantly like monitoring everything I'm doing around them. Like, oh man, is what I'm wearing, like, is that what they like? Or, constantly trying to fit myself to them. Like, if they like outgoing people, friendly people, I'm like adjusting everything, like super hypersensitive to that. But now I'm in a relationship where it's like I can be super comfortable. Like I'm not preoccupied by what he thinks of me. It's just like he's just a friend almost, right? Um, and so yeah, I think that that intensity is so unhealthy, but a lot of people associate that with love.
Yes, I would agree with you. I would agree with you. And in fact, I'd love your opinion on this too, Joyce. You know, I had somebody offer me unsolicited dating advice the other day, and it drove me in. Like,
Oh, oh.
when this
Wait,
like when this stuff happens to me, I'm like, do you know who you're talking to? Not like in an arrogant sort of sense, but more just like, get out. Like, I don't need you to talk to me about this sort of stuff. So, anyways, the conversation kind of went like this. They were like, oh, you know, what are you willing to give up for a relationship? I'm thinking, mate, like, I don't even, like, where is this coming from? Because he wanted to know, because he was like, oh, you're dating again. Well, let me help you out. I'm thinking, I don't want to hear any of this.
you're like, bro, nobody asked you.
Exactly. I was like, mate, I don't want to hear this. But anyways, I was like, yeah, whatever. What do you want to say? And he was like, oh, you know, you got to think about the 5 things that you want to give up for a relationship. I'm like, okay. And then he was like, what are your thoughts on what you want for a man? And I'm like, look, you know, to be honest, I wrote about this, you know, in my journal. I've been thinking about it consistently. I know what the values are, like, you know, and I was listing them off the top of my head. And he's like, oh, you're too fluffy. You don't know what you're looking for. And I'm like, mate, like, get out.
Ooh.
And then the final thing that really, you know, just sealed the deal for me was that he said to me, oh, you know, so when you get the butterflies, you've just got to get used to that. It's just that anxiety that comes with a relationship. That's just normal. And I said to him, no, that's not normal.
No.
That's a trauma response, mate. And he's and look, I don't mean to cast any judgment on the current relationship that he's with, but let's just say, given his relationship history, I think what I would say is that I'm not confident listening to his advice, given what he's talking about. And with my own experience of butterflies and that feeling, it's always like, danger, danger. Love to hear your thoughts on that, Joyce.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, I absolutely agree with you with the butterfly thing. Um, I think I'm less afraid of the feeling, but more afraid of like my association with that feeling. So it's what I've made that feeling out to be. So
Mm.
I don't actually believe that, you know, a butterfly response is bad for everyone, right? Like I think some people are, you know, I've talked about this in some of my content too, but some people are calibrated correctly. And so when they feel butterflies, it means they're talking to the right person. But like for some people like us, it sounds like that when we have the butterflies, it's sort of like, ooh, run the opposite direction because this reminds you of your childhood and how you were not loved. So I think just recognizing that, yeah, everybody has a different association. And, you know, I started realizing this because I would talk to a bunch of married couples because for the longest time, it escaped me how people knew who they wanted to marry. So every time I saw a married couple, I'd be like, how did you know? Tell me, tell me. And so, you know, like 90% of the time, they just be like, oh, you just know. And I'm like, no, you don't. Like every person I've dated, I thought was the
Same.
one, you know, and that classic, like love addict, classic, you know, probably avoid anxious attachment, right? So yeah, that was not helpful. And then so I kind of came to the conclusion that if some people just know, that means they're just following their instincts and they were lucky enough to get it right. But for some of us, like, you know, I always use the example of like, I don't know, any technology we use, like a laptop. Most of us don't know how a laptop works until it breaks. And then you either have to fix it or you have to hire somebody to fix it. But before that point, you don't know what's broken or why. You're just using the laptop because it's useful to you. So that's kind of how I see like the relationship thing, which is like relearning, you know, these pieces inside of you to make sure that it's functioning correctly or at least get the results that you want.
Yep, I completely agree. I love the analogy too. I think that just to complement what you're saying too, you know, I love everything you said. I I feel like it's very easy to make assumptions sometimes about the kind of people that we like as well, based on how we've grown up too. And I think that part of our growth is also figuring out when some of those ideas no longer serve us. Like, for instance, you know, having to go out of our way for other people, having to impress other people. Like what you were talking about, you know, in your current relationship, is you don't care about what your partner thinks of you. You're just like, yeah, we're cool. But we're not often like that prior to getting into a relationship. We're so often trying to play a game of impression management. And I think that stems a lot from fear of rejection, which is a socio-behavioral thing, because of course we want to feel part of a tribe, which is very innate in our, you know, in our DNA. And I think that it can be very, very challenging. I know, like, a lot of my audience, they say they really do fear rejection. They fear being told, like, I am not good enough for you. So with that in mind, you know, if we're going to take the laptop analogy, which I loved, and, you know, you're needing someone to tinker around in it like a therapist, you know, with that sort of approach, it sounds to me like if we are a laptop, unlike the users who are using it, or actually no, maybe the laptop is our body and that the user is us mentally trying to work with it. It sounds like we just have to accept the fact that sometimes we are going to need external help and support in order to make the necessary software upgrades for us. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. Especially if your expertise is not, you know, internal relationship stuff. But at the same time, it's like, I think that, you know, if you hire an expert to fix your laptop, it would, you know, be really good for you to learn a little something when they're here, right? So for myself, you know, I was going to talk about how, like, I've grown a lot in self-awareness in this specific aspect. Like, it's a very predictable pattern, something that I was not aware of before, but like every time I see somebody that I'm curious about, it always feels like really friendly, you know, like, oh, I just want to get to know them and be friends with them. And that like rapidly turns into like, oh, well, let's hang out alone. And then I notice I'm like getting disappointed that we can't hang out alone. And so it's like, I think that's what's allowed it to function so long in my life. It's because I've been lying to myself for so long about like who I'm attracted
Yes.
to. It's sort of just more of like either a curiosity or even maybe even a judgment of like, ew, that person is so, I don't know, it's like typical like playground behavior where you're sort of like, ew, that person's so stuck up and I hate the way they do their hair because like, I don't know, it's super preppy or something. But really the fact that you're giving them that negative attention, at least for me, it was sort of like, it was a way for me to not be vulnerable, because what would feel vulnerable for me is to walk up and say, like, hey, I really like your hair. Actually, it's very unique. But instead, I would just pretend to hate it, right? And I think that's where it comes from, which is like, I want to get their attention. And so that was more of like my more primitive, probably in the beginning. And then it slowly turned into like, oh, I just want to be their friend. And that turned into like, oh, well, now I'm just going to get drunk around them. And so if anything happens, then it's the alcohol. It's not me. So it's just like all these different ways that I kind of gave up responsibility in my life of like who I'm attracted to. But also, yeah, always those butterflies were just a huge indicator. Now I'm afraid of it. But before it was sort of like, oh, wow, I've never experienced this intensity before. But now I'm sort of like, all right, well, I'm walking the opposite direction because I'm taken. And now I'm like hypersensitive to my old reactions because like I tell myself, it's kind of funny. I call it monkey business. You know, it's like you know what you're doing, but you're like pretending not to know. At least that's, I don't know if you have moments like this, but I just tell myself, I'm like, Joyce, no monkey business. I know you think this guy's attractive. Don't invite
Yeah.
him over for drinks because you have a boyfriend, you know? So it's sort of like lecturing myself, like, hey, you watch yourself, you know?
Yep. Even though I'm single, I still have moments like that where I'll look at someone who I know is trouble because my gut's going off and I'm like, oh, I'm feeling that excitement factor. And for me, it's kind of like when you're standing, you know, on a cliff and you're about to go bungee jumping. It's that sort of fight or flight response in me now that I've recognized. And I think before I couldn't really feel it or identify with it nearly as much. But now I'm like, oh, yeah, my body's telling me something.
So wild.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and this is I was telling someone else too that it really doesn't matter how you look at whatever this is, I guess like the relationship, but for me it was helpful to look at it as an addiction.
Yeah, I agree with
Um, and mostly because it feels like a high. It felt like a high for me where those butterflies, I like when I started paying attention to it, it was like my whole body would be tingling and their like heat would rise to my face and like I wouldn't be able to think clearly, but it also felt like good, even though it was scary, right? And this was just like, you know, talking to this person for what is it, like 5 minutes. And, so yeah, it's definitely a high for me. And because I thought of it as an addiction, I treated it like one. And that way I could see like the patterns, I could see the compulsion that I was, you know, repeating in my life. And I think love addicts too, specifically, have a lot of shared things that probably anxious attachment is pretty overlapping. So things like, you know, what role does the fantasy play in creating that attraction and realizing that I wasn't actually attracted to them as a person, but it was more so I was attracted to their attraction for me. And so every time they sort of like complimented me or they like looked at me with those stars in their eyes, I'd be like, oh my gosh, like the feeling grew, you know? So like paying attention to that feeling too. And it was also interesting because when you said like a lot of your clients are afraid of rejection, I was thinking to myself, you know, they're probably just afraid of the experience of rejection, right? Because you could swap out the other person for anyone else and they would still have the same fear, probably the same level of fear. And so it's more to do with us and how we're processing things.
I could not agree more with you. I thought that was great. I love that. I love that. And I think by way of an example, I can definitely share something like that too. I think when we as human beings process things differently and we actively choose to look at situations in a different way, then we don't suffer the same. For instance, I remember earlier in the year, I was dating a guy who I was very much attracted to, and I could feel the intensity of the butterflies and everything. Like I said, like, you know, I feel like I'm falling in love with this guy, which is basically my expression for I'm feeling highly intimate. And I knew that I was definitely in this zone where it's like, this is dangerously uncomfortable, because there were moments where I could feel like I felt like I was walking on a knife's edge with this guy because I knew that he was trouble. But I decided to walk into it consciously. He was, as I've mentioned before to some people, it was kind of like going into Switzerland, a country of red flags. But anyways, so
Sorry, that's so good.
so with this guy, like I remember when it came to me breaking up with him, I remember it was really hard for me to get to that stage. But by hard, I mean, it took me a turnover about 24 hours. But mentally, I was not prepared on the day before that when I was like, yeah, this needs to be done, because my body was just like, no, I'm not ready to leave him yet. But I found that by doing a few exercises of just mentally, like, you know, writing down like all the things that he did to inconvenience me and all the things that, you know, were not good about him, I slowly started to mentally devalue him in my head, to the point where I got to a stage where his lack of attention and priority for me allowed me to go, oh, I just feel completely indifferent towards you now. And rejection was easy. I was like, goodbye, like it was done. And so I think for me, even though his behavior kind of made me feel a bit rejected at times, I got over it quicker because I didn't personalize it as much. And I just thought, but this isn't me. This is him. This is his shame he has to work through. This is his, you know, weird actions that he needs to process. They're completely out of whack with what he started with when he was very, you know, sincere, caring, and empathic. He's now gone to being childish, weird, and, you know, almost a bit narcissistic. And I'm like, I've done nothing wrong. I can relax. I know myself, because this is the thing, you know, I think when we're in this process, we have to remind ourselves of basic human evidence. Like, I know I'm not crazy with my friends. I know that I'm not crazy in healthy relationships. So why is it this guy that this is just happening in a really weird way? And I think it just got to the point where I was like, I had to radically accept the fact that, you know, it is what it is. It's got nothing to do with me. which I know some people might be like, oh, we're just passing the buck. It's like, no, I think that sometimes when we're in contact with certain people, they can bring out the best and the worst in us. And so that's why, for me, I'm very conscious of like even my friendship groups. Like, you know, going back to something you were saying, that love addiction. Well, I had friendship addiction with certain people too. Like, I wanted to be with, you know, certain people who I thought were impressive, you know, had a high level of extroversion, seemed popular, had a lot of stuff going on for them, but they weren't particularly nice people. You know, they were very two-faced, and it's because I'd been adapted and grew up with that kind of environment. And then when I could see it and I started stepping away from it, realizing I don't want to put up with this behavior, I'd move away from it. But again, I even felt some of that fight or flight, those butterflies with these individuals too, because it was that sort of excitement factor of like, oh, I get to be with these cool people, and then realizing, oh, they're not that good for me too. Have you had experiences similar to that with friends?
Yeah, I'm trying to think as you were talking, whether or not I have. And maybe, you know, I've never really thought about it that way because I guess I've always felt close to healthy attachment with friends. And I think I've shared this with you before, but the different forms of attachment to different people in your life. So I'm very avoidant actually with my parents, which is weird. But anxious with my romantic partner, and typically healthy with friends, and almost even on the avoidant side with friends sometimes. Because when I look at my life, a lot of my friends are similar to me in the sense that they're not needy people. Like, we kind of just like do our own thing and we reach out when we reach out. But it's not like, hey, let's hang out all the time. And so maybe I'm not sure exactly what looks healthy in a friendship, because I've questioned myself. I'm like, should I be hanging out with friends more? But like, I just get so exhausted, and I think partially because I'm an introvert. So I don't know what your thoughts are about that.
Well, as a fellow introvert, I can say I definitely get exhausted hanging around people. But I think one of the things I used to have was what I call friendship panic, where I used to think, oh God, what's this person thinking of me? And so I'd reach out to them and try and be with them. So I was still very anxious with my friends. Like, I was really worried and concerned about what they would think of me and how they would react. But then when I took a step back, I recognized they're not going anywhere. They still hang out. They don't think badly of me. It's fine. And I think this sort of ties into what I was saying earlier, which is when we choose to accept the evidence in our life that we are presented with, I think we can become more comfortable and more relaxed with the way things are. I think it's in the absence of that information, or when we're not able to look at it, we make things a lot harder for ourselves. Like, you know, when I broke up thinking I'll never have another one of love again. But it's like, no, I literally fell in love with another guy, like, you know, 8 months down the line, which means, oh, so there's more than one lover? Oh, okay. So I think really what I'm getting at is, I think that the way we're brought up has such a fundamental and significant impact on the way in which we interact with people. And a lot of that growth that I think we go through is actually the unlearning of the bad sort of conditioning we've had and coming closer to who we are as people.
That's interesting. So can you talk more on what you mean by who we are? Like, because I mean, I get what you're saying, but also, you know, I think about identity and what that means. And I always get very deep and philosophical here because I'm like, who are we really? Right? And our identity, I believe, does shift. And we also have so much capacity to be who we want to be. And so, but obviously, I think there are limits to that to some degree. Like, I probably was similar, like how I am now as when I was a kid. You know, like, I think I got a little weird in between, you know, when I was a teen. And then now I'm back to how I used to be, a little bit more vulnerable, right? Willing to just expose who I am. So is that sort of like what you're saying? I kind of want to hear more about that.
I agree with what you're saying. As like, you know, it's definitely a part of that. I think that you're absolutely right, which is that we change so much over time and we grow and we develop. You know, I would say I'm not the same person I was, you know, a few months ago. Like, if you'd known me a few months ago, I'd have said, yeah, I don't really believe in God. But now, after doing a lot of intensive reading and trusting my gut, I'd say, yeah, actually, I do believe in God. And in the sense of being, for me, an orientating compass. Like it provides me, you know, it's my intuition. I feel like I'm guided towards a service of helping people. It's not like a religious faith. It's more of a spiritual one. So, you know, I feel like I upgrade myself on a continuous basis. But what it means to be who we are, I think, is recognizing what our basic needs are. How do we respond in association with the world around us? Do we, you know, do we feel like we are in a situation where we are threatened by people? Do we speak up about it and actually express our own voice in those circumstances? And I think part of learning who we are is being an observer. Like, I don't know if you've ever read anything by Eckhart Tolle, but basically learning to, to summarize what he talks about very effectively, he talks about how when we're younger, we are often put into a position where we don't know ourselves because we're given all this information, school, family, friends. We're trying to fit in. We're trying to make sense of everything. We really do sacrifice a lot of that authentic identity that we have in school just to fit in and to feel like a sense of connection and to feel warm and loved. And so if it means people pleasing with the people who don't even share the same values as us, we'll do it. If it means that we can't, you know, afford to be out with our gender because it's not safe, we'll do it because that's the only way we perceive to be safe, or we won't. But we have an identity that's created in order to fit us for that time period. The problem is that identity, our ego, gets, you know, it extends its expiry date. We enter into new environments with new people, go to university, to college, to new work environments, and we're still carrying a lot of that identity with us. So when I say to act as an observer, we have to sort of take a step back and be like, is that me? Am I actually, you know, is this the person that I want to be? Is this identity that I've created for myself, that I unconsciously created for myself during a period of high stress during my childhood years? Do I still need to carry the shame, the same beliefs, the same thought patterns, the same behavior as I did way back when? And my answer to that is no, because I'm not in the same environment. I don't feel threatened. And I think that's why when I say, you know, it's learning I think that growth internally is so important, and we're unpacking a lot of the bad learning that we've had. I think learning to become who we are is about learning more about the identities that no longer serve us and who we feel, and, you know, how we respond in the moment to people around us.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense to me. Because I think it's less about seeing your identity as something static, right? But there's an interaction and there's a give and take. And like you said, it's observing. It's giving yourself room to sort of react how it's going to react. And I'm also thinking acceptance, right? And being able to accept those reactions while still, you know, wanting to grow, right? Because I think you have to hold those both loosely, because you can grow without hating yourself, you know? And I think a lot of people struggle with that, where they're like, well, how am I going to grow? I don't have any incentive to improve if, you know, I like the way I am now, right? There's no tug. So it's interesting to be able to observe who you are and still always work towards being better while also accepting where you're at.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that acceptance is so important too, because then it's taking ownership and responsibility for where you're at.
Definitely. But yeah, I think we started out this conversation talking about relationships and growth, but I feel like where we've sort of landed is like, yes, relationships are a cause of growth, right? Or a source of growth, but a lot of it comes from our own interactions with ourselves, how we see ourselves, who we want to be, and we are our cause for growth, right?
Yeah.
So super interesting.
Oh, I completely agree with you. I completely agree with you. I think that I would also add to that too, from all the books that I've been reading, that there is definitely reason to believe that low points in people's lives, that are just caused by other circumstances, poverty, illness, work, can definitely project someone's growth immeasurably. But I think because we spend so much time in the arena of love and with other people that have such a profound impact on on who we are as individuals, whether it be stress or any of those other aspects of our life too, or, consistent, secure, healthy relationships. These things have such a profound impact on, whether we choose to seek growth. And I think that's also, and growth, I believe, is one of the magic ingredients of a sustainable relationship. I think that, I've had some people come to me and be like, oh, I lost, attraction for the guy that I was with. And I'm like, well, why did you lose attraction? Like, what, that's not that's not the underlying issue. That's just a presenting problem. What did you learn about your partner? And they're like, oh, well, they were jealous. I'm like, well, there you go. That's your answer right there. That's a very unattractive quality. And that's someone who's stuck. They're not going to change. They're not going to grow because they believe that you are the problem. And as long as you stay in that unhealthy dynamic, this will continue.
That is so true. Yeah, because you definitely have to take responsibility, right? Like sort of going back to the rage I felt for that guy that I had feelings for. It's sort of like recognizing that, okay, just because I'm angry doesn't mean he did anything wrong, honestly. So it's sort of like being able to turn back in and say, I'm angry because of me, because of how I think about him. And it's really not an issue for me to concern, like what he did to cause this anger, right? So it's a hard place though, because a lot of people, they do have that sort of reactiveness where they're just like, well, I'm pissed because they made me pissed, It's like, no, you're pissed because you're pissed. And yeah, maybe like if you did a survey of all the people in the world, like 80% of people would say, oh, what they did was wrong. But does that make it wrong? And is that really what you're trying to do? Like see who wins here? Or like, do you want to grow from the experience?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything you said. Well, as we're nearing the end of our time together with this, Joyce, I guess my last question to you would be, if, you were to give yourself, actually, no, if you were talking to younger Joyce and she wanted to know, something about how relationships would impact her and her journey, what would you share with her?
Wow. That's usually questions that I like to ask other people.
You gotta practice what you preach.
Let's see. I know it's so hard. I ask questions sort of as like a defense mechanism sometimes. So there's something about me. Could you ask that question again?
Sure. So let's just say that you are speaking to a young person and you recognize that they're on a very similar path to something that to a life that you had prior to where you are right now. And they ask you, Joyce, how do relationships, how are they going to impact me in the future?
How are they going to impact you? So I'm giving like advice to this person.
Yeah.
Well, first I would ask, do you want advice? And then I would give advice. But anyways, so I guess sort of where I landed when I was like thinking about this topic too is that relationships are important, but there's a dark side, right? The dark side is when you rely on people too much for things that you should be taking care of on your own, whether it's like feeling safe, right? Or feeling loved, feeling comfortable, feeling protected. And I think a lot of, especially women, they expect their guy to make them feel comfortable and safe. And that's not something anybody can give you. That's something that you have to develop within yourself. And I think that a lot of relationships, they get to a point where it becomes codependent because one person expects safety from the other person expects themselves to give the other person safety. So you get this like skewed reality where both people are thinking, oh, it's okay for this to happen. But I think that ultimately the most sustainable thing is self-sufficiency and thinking to yourself, okay, where in my life do I feel resentment? Because where I feel resentment is where I'm having expectations of people. And maybe that expectation is that they owe me something, or that in this role, you know, they're playing this role in my life, whether it's like a parent or a friend or a partner, that I expect them to be a certain way. Like the jealousy thing, right? There's a little resentment because I don't want a partner that feels jealous because it shows that they're childish. And so it's like, what are you saying in your mind? What meaning are you putting on top of that? And ultimately, it's realizing that resentment is usually because there's some part of you that isn't self-sufficient yet. And that's okay. I think like going back to knowing who you are, just figuring out, okay, well, there are certain things that I'm okay with for now, even though I know it's not self-sufficient, and not having shame about it, but just recognizing it, right?
I love that. Yeah.
But yeah, no, but I want to hear your answer as well.
Well, before I do, I just want to say that was amazing. Thank you very much for sharing that. I think the thing that I would add is you will start to recognize the roles that you've been playing. And what I mean by that is that you might be someone who's come from a very abusive family, and you might start to recognize that you are starting to act like a fixer to a lot of people's problems. You want to try and make solutions to try and, you know, keep the peace. You're not fond of arguments. Question is, what's the reason for that? Is there something in your past that happened that caused you to freak out over arguments? And I could go into this with a lot more depth, but I think what I want to say out of respect for time is just that it's very interesting how when we are in relationships, we put the magnifying glass on who we are, that we can see some patterns of behavior that may not necessarily be healthy for us. So if I was speaking to younger me, I'd say you will start to recognize people-pleasing behavior, perfectionism, pretending, and you will also see what caused you to do that. You'll see that you had very conditional love, where you tried, you know, overachieving in order to achieve a sense of love from your family or even from the people around you. You didn't feel popular in school, which is why you went out of your way to try and make other people feel good about themselves. And therefore you wanted to amass a group of friends in order to satisfy a sense of loneliness that you felt. And you'll also recognize that loneliness is something that's not cured with more people in your life, but actually cured when you have people who can emotionally bond with you and get where you're coming from. So my answer is, to younger me, we will recognize patterns of dysfunction and also opportunities for growth and rebirth, essentially, of who we want to
Mm, I love that. Awesome. Well, thanks for having me on today,
That was
Ken.
so much,
I
I was going to
loved
say that was
this.
so much fun, Joyce. That was really, really good. We should definitely do this again sometime too. But just to quickly, where can people find you if they want
Absolutely.
to talk with you?
Oh, yeah. So I am at the Abundance Coach, separated by periods. And yeah, I'm actually launching something at the end of November, which I'm super excited for. So definitely look out for that. It's going to be my first ever sort of group coaching experience. So it's really going to focus on community and this idea of pursuing your dreams. And yeah, I call it a dream accelerator, sort of like a startup accelerator, but for dreams. So definitely keep your eye out for that. I'm really excited about it. So.
I was going to say, a Dream Accelerator sounds like a fantastic name for inspiration, and I'm sure it will really help many, many people out. So Joyce, thank you so much for your time. I greatly appreciated this chat with you, and we will definitely keep chatting soon. But for now, thank you everyone who watched, and yeah, we'll catch you guys around. Bye for now.
Bye.